Hi, this is Eve with True Crime and Coke. You are about to listen to an EDUsode. These are shorter episodes dedicated to educational information ranging from forensic terminology to interesting FBI files. Or you can check out one of my regular episodes. You can also find me on Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube under True Crime and Coke. So, let's get started. Hi, this is Eve. Welcome to EDUsode 15. We are continuing reading from the FBI thing, and we are on the serial sexual murders. So, I guess I'll just start. Sexually motivated murder has been the subject of numerous studies by academics, mental health professionals, researchers, and law enforcement professionals. Historically, some of these studies have attempted to delineate specific types of sexual murder and have used terms such as lust murder, sexual homicide, lust killings, and sadistic killings. The sexual acts committed by these offenders against their victims can vary greatly. These include types of sex that are considered conventional, such as vaginal, anal, and oral sex. There are also a number of unconventional sexual acts, including fetish behaviors and paraphilias. These include fetishism, post-mortem mutilation, foreign object penetration, sexual sadism, necrophilia, cannibalism, and vampirism. For the purpose of this study, sexual murder is defined as a murder where the motivation is sexual in nature. The definition was deliberately kept broad because of the unusual nature of sexually motivated murder and the involvement of a wide variety of sexual behaviors. The sex could be overt, unusual, or very subtle. The means to determine a sexual motivation included the sexual acts, sadistic acts, and any other sexual practices that occurred. These included physical evidence of sexual contact, including DNA, physical trauma to the sex organs, the victim's state of dress, the positioning of the victim by the offender, the nature of the other injuries suffered by the victim, and evidence of the offender's use of bindings. These variables were collectively used to determine a sexual motivation. Now, on the victims. In this study, 329 of the 480 victims were killed by an offender who was sexually motivated. Female victims comprised 85.4% of these victims. Male victims were 14.6% of this category. The following is the age range of the victim: 8 to 13 years of age at 3.3%. 14 to 29 years of age is at 47.4%. 30 to 45 years of age is at 35%, and over 45 years is at 9.4%. For 16 of the victims, their age could not be identified. The majority of the victims at 88.2% were under the age of 45 years of age. The racial breakdown of the victims is as follows: white, 52%, black, 38.9%, Hispanic, 6.1%, other, 2.4%. For 2 of the victims, their race could not be identified. This is the racial makeup of the offenders: white, 48.4%, black, 42.2%, Hispanic, 7.8%, other, 1.6%. The offenders were between 15 and 45 years old. Only 25% of the offenders were married, and 65.6% were employed either full-time or part-time. 45% of offenders were either renting or owned their own home. The majority of offenders, at 64.1%, had a high school diploma or higher educational level, with 39.1% having some college education. At the time of the first murder, over half, at 56.5%, of the serial sexual offenders had a prior arrest record as compared to other serial offenders at 21.7%. 25% of serial sexual offenders had prior military service as compared to other serial offenders at 7.6%. 16 serial sexual offenders were formally diagnosed by a mental health professional with a psychiatric disorder. Now, on the offender-victim relationship. So the relationship between the victim and the offender were as follows: customer-client at 55.6%, stranger or targeted stranger at 30.4%, and acquaintance at 10.3%. There were 3 cases involving a relative or family member. In 9 cases, the relationship between the victim and offender could not be determined. Offense characteristics. Of the 64 serial sexual offenders, 70.4% killed 3 or more victims, with 39.1% of them killing 5 or more victims. The offenders approached to gain access to victims by using either the ruse-con at 77.8%, by surprise at 10%, blitz at 4%, and unknown at 7.9%. The location where offenders gained access to victims were known vice areas at 43.2%, outdoor public areas at 23.7%, victims' residences at 16.1%, other 8.8%, unknown at 8.2%. Other locations include interior public businesses and areas, and offenders' residence and other living quarters. The locations where the sexual assaults took place: outdoor public areas at 23.4%, offenders' residences at 21.6%, victims' residences at 15.5%, offenders' vehicles at 17.6%, unknown at 15.2%, and other at 6.7%. Other locations include interior public and business area and other living quarters. In 63.2% of the cases, the offender drove to the murder site. The murder locations: outdoor public areas at 27.7%, offenders' residences at 21.3%, victims' residences at 15.8%, offenders' vehicles at 14%, unknown at 16.4%, and other at 4.8%. And then again, other locations included interior public and business area and other living quarters. So the specific disposal sites: outdoor public areas at 72.6%, victims' residences at 14.6%, offenders' residences at 2.4%, other 7%, and unknown at 3.3%. And again, other locations include interior public, business area, and living quarters. Additionally, 6 victims were not recovered. The causes of death are as follows: strangulation at 51.6%, blunt force trauma at 13.7%, stab wounds at 10.6%, gunshot wounds at 7.6%, undetermined at 9.1%, other at 0.6%, unknown at 4.9%. The undetermined category was ruled by a medical examiner. In 75.1% of the cases, the victims were found nude or partially nude. There was evidence of sexual contact in 49.5% of cases, and DNA was recovered in 29.2% of the cases and was found in the victim, on the victim, or at the crime scene. There was evidence of post-mortem sexual activity in 11.2% of the cases. The number of cases in which DNA was recovered, at 29.2%, was much higher as compared to other serial offenders whose DNA was only recovered in 2.7% of the cases. This highlights the need for law enforcement to utilize proper recovery techniques when processing sexually motivated murders. Bindings were utilized in 31.3% of the cases. Offenders took objects in 53.8% of the cases, and clothing was the most commonly taken item. There were 8 instances of unusual sexual acts, such as foreign object penetration. Time frames. The time frame was calculated between when the murders occurred and when the victims' bodies were recovered. Victims found less than 1 day after murder were at 31.3%. Victims found between 1 and 15 days was at 27.7%. Victims found after 15 days at 10.2%, and in 30.8% of the cases, the time frame could not be determined. There is a distinct contrast in time frames when examining serial sexual murderers and the other types of offenders in this sample. Among serial sexual murders, bodies recovered within 15 days occurred in 59% of cases versus 23.3% of other cases. Additionally, among sexual serial murder cases, victims recovered in less than 1 day occurred in 31.3% of cases versus 12.7% of other cases. Body disposal: transported and concealed, 24.6%. Surface, 12.2%. Water, 8.8%. Burial, 3.6%. transported and dumped, 31.9%, left as is at the murder site, 33.4%, left at the murder site and concealed, 8.2%, body not recovered, 1.8%. In sexually motivated murders, there were more instances of offenders transporting their victims than other types of murders. Now we are on to serial prostitute murders. Serial prostitute victims are a subset of serial sexual murders, as discussed before. Prostitutes are considered high-risk victims because of the nature of their work in which they engage in sex acts with total strangers for money. They are also visible and easily identifiable for a would-be offender as they are frequently located in areas known for prostitution activities. A large portion of them are drug and/or alcohol dependent, and their judgment could be impaired. Also, their judgment regarding who they will engage in sex with can be clouded by their need to obtain substances to fuel their drug or alcohol dependency. Some prostitutes also have a very transitory lifestyle and are not accountable to anyone for large blocks of time. It can be extremely difficult to track the activities of someone engaged in this lifestyle. All of these factors increase the risk prostitutes may become the target of a serial killer. Additionally, the murder of a prostitute can be very challenging for law enforcement investigators to solve. The covert nature of sexual activities, coupled with the number of interactions with strangers, makes identification of any customers who may be critical witnesses extremely difficult. In this study, 154 of the 480 victims were engaged in prostitution activities, and the majority of victims were female at 84.4%. The age ranges were 14 to 29 years old at 37%, 30 to 45 years old, 48.1%, over 45 years old, 7.1%, unknown at 7.8%. The racial breakdown of the victims: white, 27.9%, black, 64.3%, Hispanic, 5.8%, other, 1.3%, unknown, 0.6%. The racial makeup of the offenders is black, 55.6%, white, 33.3%, Hispanic, 7.4%, other, 3.7%. The offenders were between 21 and 43 years old. Descriptors are based upon the first murder in the series. At the time of the first murder, 25.9% of offenders were married and 40.7% lived as dependents of either family members or paramours, with 14.8% of offenders being homeless. Over half of the offenders, at 51.8%, had a high school diploma or higher educational level, with 40.7% having some college education. Less than a quarter, at 22.2%, had prior military service, and 70.4% were employed either part or full-time at the time of the first homicide. The majority of offenders had a prior arrest record at 92.6%, and only 11.1% were formally diagnosed by a mental health professional with a psychiatric disorder. The offender and victim relationship. The relationship between all of the offenders and victims were customer-client. Offense characteristics. Of the 27 offenders, 66.6% of them killed 3 or more victims, with 37% of them killing 5 or more victims. The majority of offenders, at 98.7%, utilized a ruse or con approach to gain access to the victims, and in 3/4 of the cases, 74.7%, the offenders made initial contact in known vice areas. All murders were sexually motivated. The primary location where the initial assaults took place were offenders' residences at 34.4%, outdoor public areas at 23.4%, offenders' vehicles at 18.2%. The primary murder locations are offenders' residences, 34.4%, outdoor public areas, 26%, offenders' vehicles, 17.5%. Over 80% of all victims were killed and assaulted in the same location. In 65.6% of the cases, the offender drove to the murder site. The specific disposal sites are as follows: outdoor public areas, 82.5%, offenders' residences, 5.2%, other, 8.4%, Additionally, 2.6% of victims' bodies were not recovered. Causes of death. Strangulation was at 63%. Blunt force trauma was at 17.5%. Undetermined at 10.4%. Other at 3.9%. And in 5.2% of the cases, the victims' bodies were not recovered, and the undetermined category was ruled by a medical examiner. In 75.3% of the cases, the victims were found nude or partially nude. There was evidence of sexual contact in 61.7% of cases, and DNA found either in the victim, on the victim, or at the crime scene in 28.6% of the cases. In addition, there was evidence of post-mortem mutilation on 13 victims. Time frames. The time frame was calculated between when the murders occurred and when the victims' bodies were recovered. Victims found less than 1 day after murder was at 26.6%. Victims found between 1 and 15 days was at 29%. Victims found after 15 days at 3.6%. In 40.3% of the cases, the time frame could not be determined. Body disposal. Transported and concealed at 26%, with surface being 13.6%, water being 10.4%, and burial being 1.9%. Transported and dumped was at 37%, left as is at the murder site at 29.9%, left at the murder site and concealed at 4.5%. Additionally, in 2.6% of the cases, the victims' bodies were not recovered. Less than 1/2 of offenders utilized different body disposal systems.